So next up here, task is to add to our toolkit inflation, what it is, how to calculate for it, how to understand it, etc. Now, I know some of you have heard of this because I've seen it pop up in a few different assignments, this idea of this term inflation that you have at least picked up in the popular press or in discussions with family members. Of course, at least my reading from much of the homework is that while you're familiar with the term, you don't actually know what it is. So this is our chance to zoom in and figure out what this thing is. So here's an example of something that intrigues me. So this was a sign at the South African Zimbabwean border that said, no toilet or toilet paper only to be used in this toilet, no cardboard, no cloth, no newspaper. Now that part, that's not uncommon. We see these signs all over the place, and it makes sense that people don't want you flushing this stuff down the toilet because it clogs it up and so forth. The piece that jumps out to me about this sign is the no Zim dollars part. In other words, that means no Zimbabwean dollars. So that seems also comprehensible why the shopkeeper wouldn't want people flushing Zim dollars down the toilet. Probably is going to have a similar impact to the others. But that does leave us with the question of, is it cost effective for Zimbabweans to use money instead of toilet paper? Well, at the time of that image being posted, a roll of toilet paper cost about $1.50 US. And a roll of toilet paper has about 352 sheets per roll, which means each sheet is worth about 4/10 of a penny. 4/10 of a penny converts, or converted at the time of that image, to 3,600 Zim dollars. So what does this tell us? Well, this tells us that using a 1,000 Zim note is a wise financial decision. Doesn't mean that it's a wise health or sanitation decision, but it certainly is almost around a quarter as expensive to use a $1,000 note rather than a sheet of toilet paper. So that, of course, raises the question is, how the heck do we get to a situation where it's cheaper to use money than toilet paper? Now, that might seem a little bit less hyperbolic now, given the toilet paper shortage, than it would have 6 months ago. But it definitely does raise a question. Even in our current environment, I don't think many of us are using dollar bills instead of toilet paper. So that brings us to this thing, inflation. What the heck is inflation? We know that prices change all the time. Prices move all over the place because of fluctuations in supply and demand, or both. Inflation is not a change in a price. So the fact that the price of toilet paper has gone up does not mean, if it has gone up, does not mean that we have seen inflation. The fact that the prices of certain other goods have gone down does not mean that we have seen deflation or negative inflation. Inflation, rather, is an increase in the average level of prices or in the price level. Now, hold off for a moment if you're wondering how the heck we measure it. That's something we'll talk about here in a moment. But this is an increase in the average level of prices. And if you take P here to be our measure of the price level or the average level of prices, inflation is just the percent change in the price level. So hopefully that percent change formula makes some sense to you. You've seen it before. We've seen it all over the place, frankly. We've seen it in growth. We're seeing it in inflation and so on. So this is just our percent change formula. Our new minus our old divided by our old times 100. So again, roll with me here that we have a reasonable measure of the price level. So if we have the price level has gone down, we have negative inflation or negative percent change in the inflation rate. Oftentimes that is similarly called deflation or negative inflation. On the other hand, positive inflation is just an increase in the price level. Now the book has this chart with an elevator. You know me, I like to try and put motion in here given that we have the option. So let's take a look here. So this is maybe the space where we have different prices for different goods and different services here. And in here, we could reasonably add in all goods and all services, and our prices range from here to here, and we probably would want to weight these for their importance and then we could look at the average level. So how does this work? Well, at some points in time, and again, right, at some points in time, some prices go up and some go down. However, if there's no change in the overall price level because the increase in some prices is outweighed by the decrease in other prices, then there is a fluctuation in the price of goods and services. In effect, what we were talking about when we're using supply and demand. Prices move up and down, but that is not an increase in the price level nor a decrease in the price level. In order for there to be inflation, what would have to happen, going back to our base level here, is that the increase in some prices outweighs the decrease in other prices, causing an increase in the price level or a decrease in the price level. And this is important because oftentimes people really do point to the overall rise in the price of gasoline or the fall in the price of, or in the, right, the fall in the price of gasoline, the rise in rental prices or home prices and billings. And they say, look, there's inflation or there's deflation. But we're really not talking about individual prices. What we need is some way to look at the overall price level. And we'll get to that. But for right now, the key is to understand conceptually what inflation or deflation is. So how do we measure the price level? So that's the next piece here. How do we get that measure of the price level? Now, one way, and probably the most common way, is a price index. In this case, we're talking about a consumer price index. And this is the one you'll oftentimes see that is being used for cost of living adjustments and so on and so forth. So what is a consumer price index? In effect, what we do is we compare what a typical household buys in a year. And we take that bundle of goods or that basket of goods for this year and we compare that price with last year and compare it with the price before. And it depends on which of these we're talking about. Some price indices, some CPI include 30,000 different goods, some are 8,000, but it's a lot of different goods. Now, again, this makes my brain hurt. The prospect of going out and collecting all the prices of all the goods that a consumer typically buys in a year, that makes my brain hurt. But let's assume and let's run with the idea that there are some very smart people out there who are working on this. And as I mentioned, we would weight these by their importance. So whipping cream may be very important in some people's lives, but we would typically give a greater weight to lodging, heat, some of these other things. Again, different indices are structured in slightly different ways. You can go look at a whole bunch of these. If you go to the St. Louis Federal Reserve Economic Database, or FRED, you will find a couple hundred different measures of the price level. In effect, well, that's one way. The other way here is what we call a GDP deflator. Now, we know here that we have all prices of final goods and services because that's what we needed to construct GDP. And so what do? We use them to calculate something very similar to a CPI. Now, this is a broader measure because it's going to include final goods and services that maybe the typical household doesn't consume or that are consumed by businesses or so on and so forth, or consumed by government. And so GDP deflators are a broader measure than a CPI. So if what you want to understand is what's happened to the prices that consumers face, you would want to use a CPI. If you're talking more broadly about the economy, we'd want to use a GDP deflator. There's another option. There's a whole bunch of different PPIs or producer price indices. And this is going to be measuring, again, the price, typical price received by producers. And this is going to include final and intermediate goods, which means it is an even broader measure than GDP deflator. So that's some sense of what these different things are. Now, the key is you obviously want to be using the right one. In my econometrics class, when students are looking at corporate revenues, there's always a tendency to use a CPI that's narrowly constructed for the industry that their company is in. However, the problem with that is that CPI is going to largely include their corporate revenues. And so what you probably want to do in that situation is use a much broader measure. Again, these are technical issues There are nuances as to which one you might want to use in which situation. For our purposes here, it's useful to understand big picture, the differences between them, and then also the big takeaway should be how these work. So basically what we do is we set the price. Maybe we don't even need to worry about the average price. What we could do is just take the price of that entire bundle of goods that the typical household buys. And so we set that as our frame of reference. And then basically from there on out, what we look at is the price as a percentage of that baseline year. And so we would take our new price divided by our baseline price, or our price in a given year divided by the baseline price, which is why in our base year for the index, the index is going to equal 100 because you have the price of the bundle in that year divided by the price of the bundle in that year. That's going, and then you multiply by 100. So it would be 1 times 100, which is 100. If the price level was double for that, if the price for that bundle was double the next year, then you would divide that price of that bundle by the price in the previous year. You're going to get 2 and multiply by 100. And so that's really how we end up with our index here. We take the price level in a given year, or the price of the bundle in a given year, and you divide by the price level in your baseline year, and that gives you your index. So this here, again, I told you we were going to be seeing those formulas again. In this case, we're not dealing with percent change. We are simply dealing with percentage. Now, it turns out that if we were to just keep the price of the bundle around, or the price of the basket around, we would be able to calculate inflation without any issues. We would just look at the percent change in the price of that bundle. However, it turns out in record keeping and in dealing with this stuff, it's nice to have an index. It makes our lives easier because instead of looking at $62,428.13 compared to, right, in this year versus $58,122.06, we can end up with something that is 83 or 120 or, right? So basically a price index is just structured the way it is to make our lives easier so we don't have to copy over large numbers here. So a price index may look daunting and intimidating, but like many of these things, in my view, it is there to make our lives easier. So from that, looking at the bundle of goods, you can look at what's happened to inflation between 1950 and 2010. So you get some pretty big fluctuations. The price level has moved around a lot. We've typically seen positive inflation. There's been a couple times during this period where we saw negative inflation or deflation, but by and large, we have had positive inflation. So this raises, of course, two questions. One would be, what causes the price level to move around? And then the other question would be, what causes the movement in the price level to typically be greater than zero? Why is there an upward trend much of the time? So those are sort of two questions to address here. In the United States, across this period, the long-term growth rate was around 3.7%, which at 3.5%, that would mean the price level is doubling roughly every 20 years. And so across this time period, the price level would have doubled about 3 times. So we would have gone from 100 to 200, that's one doubling, to 400 to 800. So basically the prices in 2010 are arguably, or the price level is going to be 8 times larger, 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8. That doesn't mean that things are more expensive. It means that it takes more units of currency to buy the same amount of stuff, but that's also happened to earnings. So we're going to talk about that here in a moment. Now, in latter years, maybe this average level has fallen. We will see. In the current environment, we have definitely seen some downward pressure on inflation. It'll be interesting to see if this trend changes going forward. But so the upshot of this positive trend here is that if we look at this CPI, or the price of a basket of goods, either way you want to look at this, between 1915 and 2005, we've seen a dramatic increase in how much money it takes to buy the same basket. Now, there are going to be some issues with this because the price of a basket in 2005, is that the same basket as in 1915? Probably not. And so we've got some quality adjustments. There's some technical aspects that we really would have to wrestle with. Again, for anybody who takes intermediate macro, this is something that we will definitely delve into to get a better picture as to how we address these things. But for our purposes here, we can trust that the statisticians are doing a good job. So if we were in class, we could spend some time here and try and figure out the values. Basically, as you may have imagined, 10, 36.7, 100, and 207, they put those in as the price of a basket, but in effect, they are actually not the price of a basket. They are a CPI. However, they're analogous and we can use them the same way. So I'm going to pause this here. I'm going to stop the video, and I would encourage you to take a moment and calculate the values listed here at the bottom. Inflation between 1913 and 1969. On the right, we have 1913 to 1969. Those should darn well better be the same. And then we have 13 to 82 versus 69 to 82, and 13 to 2007 versus 82 to 2007. So on the left, you have the big picture, the big total, basically that would be the percent change in aggregate. And on the right, you have it in smaller chunks. So I'll stop this here. I encourage you to pause this, take a moment to crank through these calculations, and then you'll get a chance to check yourself here in just a moment.